the popular story that I repeated is that Google sort of added turn by turn to Android. They wanted all this data from Apple that Apple didn't want to give. And so Apple was increasingly stuck with an inferior Maps product on the iPhone. And they sort of like responded by building their own Maps product, which, by the way, was terrible. And it was made fun of for years and years and years. They've grinded on it. They've iterated. In my experience, I mentioned I'd been using Apple Maps. In my experience, I went back to Google Maps. I do still find it better for various reasons, but there's no question that Apple Maps is a really solid product now. It is the product of Apple competing with Google, and it's downstream from Google competing with Apple for sort of smartphones. Now, was there the fundamental structure of that deal? Was it possible for Google to pass on data to Apple? Like, how could it work? Go back and forth. There's lots of like fuzziness in sort of history, but the important takeaway, whatever happened, however Google and Apple sort of broke up, what happened is Google realized, crap, if we're not default, we have a big problem. Because even though Apple Maps was pretty crappy, and particularly back then was massively inferior to Google Maps, most people still used Apple because that's what was on their phone. It was good enough for sort of most people. And so you think about it from Google's perspective, it's a real wake-up call. It's like, look, it doesn't matter. Like, distribution is so powerful and it's so important that even if we have a much better product, it's really hard to sort of acquire customers. And it's, ironic because everyone complains about how much money they have to pay to Google and Facebook to acquire customers, and they sort of get a taste of their own medicine. And yeah, it's pretty tough. And so in that case, let's keep paying Apple. And as smartphones exploded, it became a situation where, the customer sort of owns the bank, as it were, where Google's paying Apple so much. Now, Apple has such a dependency on this sort of money that they're not sort of going anywhere. And again, it's perfectly rational. People are like, well, this is just one of the realities here is people are like, why, if Google is the quote unquote best, why do they have to pay all this money to Apple? And the real takeaway of this case, and generally speaking, is that I talk about defaults in distribution all the time, and I and everyone else still probably underrates how powerful defaults in distribution are. And from Google's perspective, it's like, well, if we just keep sharing, and it's on the order of tens of billions of dollars a year, we don't need to worry about our most potent competitor from a resource perspective and particularly from a distribution perspective sort of taking on our business. It's better to keep a percentage of all searches than to have to compete for all of them.
Yeah, well, and I mean, there's literally an alternate timeline where Google and Apple compete, and Google fares far worse in that timeline than it has in the search timeline. And it's just really clarifying for anyone who's looking to understand the business logic of Google's revenue sharing arrangement with Apple, where it's not necessarily that Google is worried about Bing buying up defaults and taking huge amounts of market share. It's Apple that Google is worried about, and it's a hedge against Apple itself getting involved in search.
And to this extent, it's Bing taking over. It's Bing via Apple's distribution.
Right.
And that's the crazy thing about this case. In many respects, what is at issue in this case is Apple's power, not Google's. And yet it was an antitrust case against Google. Like, it's almost like we need to the extent you want to address this issue, we need a new arena of law that is about these duopolistic arrangements. And this might be a problem on appeal where is the DOJ actually suing the right company?
I was going to say, is Apple the right defendant here? Well, I mean, to that point, you wrote a piece in 2020 that holds up exceptionally well 4 years later. I didn't realize how many people back then were calling this a weak case.
Why? Not just a weak case, but that was the article that all your allies went off on me, saying I had no idea what I was talking about. Who's this guy talking about antitrust? Like, drinking the Kool-Aid, blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
But you were supportive of the effort.
I know, that's the crazy thing. But the reason I was supportive of the effort, I was supportive in the context of being critical of all the other efforts, which we've gone back and forth with a million times on this episode.